Hello, my name is Peter Veth, and I'm Professor of Archaeology at the University of Western Australia. And it gives me enormous pleasure to present this National Archaeology Week talk on deserts of Australia. I'm going to be talking about past and future work in the great deserts of Australia, new understandings we have about the deep and remarkable antiquity and adaptations of Aboriginal people to all of the deserts of Australia, and going to share some current ideas that we're working on with collaborative communities across the northwest deserts of Australia. I'll now share my screen. I will be talking about a large range of deserts which cover almost a third of the continent, and then focusing more on deserts of northwest Australia, specifically the Ningaloo Cape Range area, through the Pilbara and into the adjacent Western Desert, which is a huge area in its own right. Viewers are cautioned that there will be pictures of deceased Aboriginal folk, and there may be other areas that they wish not to see. I acknowledge specifically that I'm transmitting and based on Whadjuk land, and pay my respects to the ancestors and their traditional custodians, past and present. I also acknowledge the lands and the customs, all of the traditional custodians, owners I have the privilege of working with across northwest Australia. In a recent paper with colleagues Joe McDonald and Peter Hiscock, we looked at the idea that deserts were in fact not barriers, were not liminal and difficult landscapes for Aboriginal people to encounter when they first settled northern and other parts of Australia. Clearly, climate has varied through time. We know there were major periods of great aridity, coldness, and increased winds at various times, such as the last glacial maximum, the last ice age. But as we've become more aware of regional variations, it's quite clear that there's quite complex paleoclimate and occupation records across the vast areas, which we tend to call a little bit homogeneously as deserts. And as I hope to share with you, these are in fact very, very different and heterogeneous areas. In our paper, and I'll pick up these themes as the talk progresses, we suggest that people probably settled the deserts as early as 60,000 years ago, possibly as early as some of the first settlements of Australia. And this is at the tail end of marine isotope stage 4, when conditions are thought to have been wetter and a little bit colder in the north. In fact, the large lakes of the north, such as Lake Gregory and Lake Woods, but certainly the larger water systems, would have potentially allowed early access into the dune fields and the sand plains and the ranges of the deserts today, which we call the Great Sand Desert, the Tarari and others of the north. Some of the best demographic and genetic modelling at the moment, and the emerging archaeology, is suggesting that Aboriginal people settled Australia, or settled the landmass of Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania rapidly, possibly as quickly as 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. And they probably relied on networks of water points, not just rivers, not just coordinated drainage courses, because in fact they don't occur in large areas of the interior deserts, but on water points that could be springs, soaks, rock holes, or indeed large flood-out events, such as the Cooper's Creek, which happens every 10 years. And there were probably quite a lot of regional variations across the vast deserts of Australia in the first 10, 20,000 years of occupation. But what's quite clear now is that regional differences, what people call nura or country, were established very early on, possibly as early as 30,000 years ago. So what is a desert? It's a landscape or region with sparse vegetation that receives less than 250 millimetres of rain annually. It has a lot of evaporation, and it covers large areas of the country. There are the classic dune field, stony and upland deserts, which are shown here in the darker hues, but there are adjacent rangelands and lowlands such as Exmouth and parts of the Centralian ranges to the north, which were clearly desert as well. And indeed, when we look at the topography and the shape and the water resources and the floristic, the plant diversity in these different deserts, from the sandy deserts to the wellgrass deserts to the massive ironstone uplands of the Pilbara, the stony desert, through to the large caves and karst formations of Northwest Cape of the Ningaloo coast. They're radically different, and obviously people had quite different strategies for adapting and living and extracting resources and socialising through these landscapes. And part of our current work is to celebrate and profile that diversity working with host organisations. We look at this map of the great deserts of Australia, from the Simpson Strez Lecky to the Tanami to the Great Victoria Desert. You can see they occupy a vast swathe of the interior. But directly adjacent to them are these arid, semi-arid lands which extend all the way through to Shark Bay on the west coast, to the edge to the semi-arid lands of the Willandra Lakes in the southeast, and of course up into the northeast into Queensland, and then the massive Nullarbor Plain of the south coast. But the point I make again is these are all radically different environments with their own occupation and deep histories. Our understanding of the deserts has possibly changed more quickly than even the dating of the first occupations or settlement of Australia by Aboriginal people. It wasn't that long ago that Richard Gould had dated the first sites in Central Australia back to 10,000 years ago, and argued that Aboriginal people had been there for the Holocene period, or 10 or 12,000 years. He portrayed that kind of adaptation as being conservative, relatively unchanging, people chasing rain, following resources on a fairly ad hoc but deliberate basis over large tracts of country, and characterised a lot of the stone tool industries and economic strategies as quite unchanging. Later on, the archaeologist Rhys Jones, who suggested that occupation of Australia was earlier, back at 50,000 years ago, thought that parts of the arid zone, the desert, had been occupied early, but these were mainly the margins. And then he saw this large area shown as this grey dark hatching in the middle as being an ecological zone, the so-called dead heart, which was not occupied until much later. And he was writing this in 1979. Then Mike Smith, the Australian archaeologist who specialised in deserts and worked at the National Museum, obtained the first Pleistocene dates at the site of Putijara in the Cleland Hills of the Western Macdonalds of Central Australia. And these dates, which were eventually shown to be over 30,000 years ago, showed that people had gone into the arid interior of Australia earlier than had been thought. He showed that there were changes in those occupations, that people used different kinds of oak quarries and had different kinds of social relations through time. And in his last major book in 2013, he thought there was a staggered occupation of the desert, which may have been as early as 45,000 years ago on the edge of the deserts, and then 40,000 years ago on the arid coast of Western Australia. My colleague Peter Hiscock, at the same time as Mike, and in fact myself, doing my PhD in the late 80s, worked on Lawn Hill in the interior Gulf country of northeast Australia, and showed that during the last ice age, the last dry period, groups contracted a lot of their economic and stone procurement strategies around the quite spectacular gorges and water bodies of Lawn Hill, shown here. And then with relaxation of climate by the early Holocene, with the return of the monsoonal systems, people expanded their range. So we're getting different pictures, but similar kinds of take-homes from different parts of the arid zone. In my own work, working with the Mardu people of these huge areas of the Western Desert, technically the last large societies to make contact with Europeans in the 1950s and 60s, over 200,000 square kilometres just for one of their native title claims. I recorded a lot of sites with them which were just dating to the last 5,000 years, remarkably rich sites, rock art, strong chains of connection and association as you'd expect from that recent history. But it was clear that they used the deserts in a very, very structured but quite deliberately flexible or agile way, so that when certain water resources or springs were losing volume, they'd move to areas which were known to have permanent waters. And so they're occupying a large area of the Little and Great Sandy Deserts and the edge of the Pilbara, the Eastern Pilbara, in a very mobile fashion, which still allowed them to occupy all of their country most of the time, unless there was a major or regional drought, in which case they could fall back into adjoining country. And based on my work with Mardu, I thought there probably had been a deep record of dynamism in the way Aboriginal people had used the arid zone of Australia and developed or amplified the concepts of refuges or refugia like the Pilbara uplands, corridors like some of these areas around the edges of the Kimberley uplands and the Pilbara, and then so-called barrier deserts, which were thought to have been used permanently at a later stage, the big sand dune deserts of the Great Sandy Desert, the Little Sandy Desert, where in fact we, after many years of work, had still found a more recent record of 5,000 or 10,000 years of occupation. As I'll show as the talk continues, we've now managed to find sites quite hard to get to and quite hard to locate in rangelands and areas which are more or less in the dunefields, which show that people were actually in them earlier on and probably responding, as I said before, in very flexible and agile ways to cope with increasing aridity, changes in water table, but also focusing on those permanent waters they always knew transect their nura. So this is very much a dynamic model of people using, exploiting and surviving deserts. Then my colleagues Peter Hiscock and Lindy Wallace developed a desert transformation model, which saw people coming into many of these arid substrates and areas, including the Lake Eyre Basin and areas to the west, and obviously the Willandra Lakes early on. And this was during a slightly more lacustral or wetter period. And at that stage, I think they were entertaining 40, 50,000 years. And then with increasing aridity during the last glacial period, with decreasing water, with increasing evaporation, with colder temperatures, which could have been as cold as 8 or 9 degrees Celsius lower, which is significant, they saw the desert or the desert structure and climate actually come into groups in situ. In other words, it was an endemic adaptation that happened after groups had moved through much of Aboriginal Australia, and that was a persuasive model which still holds water today. In another paper with colleagues led by Chris Clarkson, Cashy Norman, Joe O'Connor, Jane Barr, and Kerry Shipton, we looked at some of the evidence of the first, if you like, for Aboriginal people and their cultural expressions across Australia. And there are remarkable records that's worth emphasising in this public talk. That some of the earliest known sites for modern peoples, anatomical modern peoples like us, are outside of Africa and Australia. Some of the earliest evidence for maritime skills and processing plants comes from Aboriginal Australia. The founding population is now modelled by some people to be over 3 million, which is really high. And the technologies which are clearly being dated from the north and the south, from the deserts, include edge-ground axes, now back to 46,000 years ago, the earliest of these complex stone tool manufacturing techniques anywhere in the world. Ornaments such as shell bead necklaces, micaceous ochres, other kinds of grinding materials, certainly back at 40,000, if not edging to 50,000. And it would appear, and the desert story is central to this, that people are adapting to a wide range of environments by at least 50,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. And part of our current enterprise working with communities is to look at some of their very special sites that have those very, very deep and early records that potentially date before 50,000 years ago. In that paper on Indigenous archaeology, different age ranges were generated to show that, in fact, the early sites of the north, like Mudgebaby, which is well known in that Bayesian range or brackets of 68 to 61,000 years, does stand out as early. But when other sites, particularly around the desert, like Booty Cave on Barrow Island, Kundatukur, or Serpent's Glen in the Carnarvon Ranges of the desert, Warachi on the northern Flinders Ranges, like Mungo, actually have ranges which expand and overlap or very, very close to those earliest dates from Northern Australia. So the earliest dates aren't just in the north, they tend to be in the northwest tranche, and there are a lot of desert sites which come in that earliest bracket. In fact, when I mapped this recently for Northwest Australia, you can see that of the 13 sites in the northwest which are older than 45 to 50,000 years ago, Sites like Riwi, Carpenter's Gap, but those like Booty Cave and several in the Pilbara uplands, which are named here. 11 of the 13 early sites we have for the northwest of Australia, or Sahul, actually come from the deserts, from the arid zone. So apart from the fact that you'd expect things not to preserve as well in the deserts, maybe in fact in the Australian conditions, we are getting good preservation, but I think we do have an increasing body of evidence that people are using the desert systematically. And as we now work on these quite intractable and difficult sites, which might be in small sandstone gorges, out in the open around lake edges like Lake Gregory, near fluvial deposits in rivers of the Kimberley, which were drier at the time, or on the island, Barrow Island sites, which were part of the mainland for the first 45,000 years of people's occupation. We're starting to piece together a record which shows that desert occupation is early. Now, is 50 to 45,000 plausibly the age of settled desert? What do the lowest units that have been excavated from key sites suggest to us at the moment? And here I refer to a paper called Settling the West 50,000 Years in a Changing Land, just published a few years ago, led by Joe Dorch with colleagues. Well, the work's ongoing. It's got to be detailed. It's meticulous. We do very careful dating. We look at context. We use micromorphology, microcontexts, paleomagnetism, a whole range of techniques to ensure that things are associated. But in most of the sites that we have robust and good associations of artefacts and dates, there are earlier artefacts, there's earlier records of fired sediments, and occasionally fauna and other kinds of environmental remains, suggesting that the record could be older than 50 for much of Aboriginal Australia, just not the territory. And here is one site I've worked on with colleagues, Sue O'Connor and Joe McDonald over the years in the Little Sandy Desert. That site has now returned dates in the range of 50,000 to 48,000 years ago, based on radiocarbon AMS dating. Numerous dates across the base of the site. It's an extraordinarily rich rock art site, which has also been partially dated. It has very early geometric microliths. As you can see from this picture, we work very closely with the Birraboola Ranges on this particular site and others in the region. What's clear from the basal levels of this site, and here we can see some very neat sections which show the changes in context and sediments through the top to the bottom. There are artefacts in stratigraphic units 7 and 8 which have not been dated yet. In fact, the site has not been OSL dated, optically stimulated luminescent dated. It will have challenges because of the rock content, but I think it can be dated by OSL, and I suspect it will come back earlier than the radiocarbon, but that will be tested. On Barrow Island, where we've worked for the last 10 years, sampling both the occupation of this small island, but for most of its history, the submerged coastal plain and surrounding them the northwest shelf, and indeed the marine resources from the Pleistocene coastline, we have a good record of fauna in the site before people occupied it. So from 70, 75,000 years ago, small cave fauna, little bats and mice and so forth. You can see how deep this excavation is. And by putting together very detailed cross-checking OSL and radiocarbon dates from 4 laboratories, looking at changes in the chemistry and the marine resources and the terrestrial fauna, mainly arid species, but a few tropical ones also being introduced. We are comfortable that there are artefacts and occupation between about 51 and 46,000 years ago. But beneath this date and above this discontinuity and above the OSL date of 77,000 are burnt shellfish remains, are small microdebitage, small pieces of introduced and local lithic material, and indeed some baler shell as well. So those lower stratigraphic units stratigraphically sit below an OSL date of 51.1, but of course we're doing very detailed work now to see if we can reliably date that to earlier than this period. This shows the position of that burnt shell and stone material being worked on by colleagues Fiona Hawke, Kane Ditchfield and others. We also are looking at sites like Mandu Creek Rock Shelter and others in the extraordinarily beautiful and well-preserving calcarenite old limestone of the Cape Range, where important sites have been found with things like early conus shell bead necklace dated to approximately 36,000 years ago. Very good work done by the WA Museum and Kate Mawson colleagues in the late 80s, but no systematic survey in between, apart from Catherine Griswold's detailed work in the northern part of the Cape in the 1990s. And now we're poised for a whole era of detailed survey and testing of areas within the World Heritage Area in an area which is quite extraordinary in terms of preservation. Here's a picture of Kate in the original Mandu jig. We've returned to that and done OSL dating, and in fact found evidence for people in that site during the last ice age at the last glacial maximum, which was not recorded during the original work, which relied on radiocarbon dating. So we know by going back to existing sites, using finer grained and high resolution dating, and also working on new sites nearby, we hope to both fill gaps in the record and extend the record. We did in fact excavate a small site nearby, Mandu 2, which dated to the Holocene. That filled the entire Holocene record, which had been near absent from some of the other regional sites, and in fact found a Thylacine elements, teeth and other material mandibles dating between about 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, which is a fantastic find. And here's Cashy Norman taking background readings, the symmetry readings of the sediments at Mandu and obtaining samples. There are a large number of shelters and caves within that system, which have evidence of people bringing marine resources into the ranges thousands of years ago. But there's also recent material. We've dated people in the Cape Range during the 1600s. The Dutch made contact and landed in the area, and in fact material during the contact period, we think during the late 1800s. So we have material evidence of people living in the Exmouth region during a phase where it's often been mythologised that they left and there was no Aboriginal presence, and that's not the case. The archaeology shows there were people there. They were there when there were shipwrecks in the 1800s, like the wrecks like the Stefano, and it's quite likely that they were being centralised in pastoral stations, missions, and even tragically lock hospitals in areas like Shark Bay. Hazel Walgar, who features in the Tim Winton Ningaloo series, launching on the 16th of May, finding a shell bead on the surface of this site, a cultural advisor to the Joint Management Board, traditional owners at the site at the end of our excavations in 2021. Another site we've worked on that was originally worked on by Jim Bowler and then returned to myself and Mike Smith and Alan Williams and others was the edge of Lake Gregory, one of the big lakes I mentioned before. They were at least 10 times larger during the earlier wetter periods at 100,000 years ago and possibly later. And we picked the edge of where the mega lake would have been, working closely with Mullen community, with Jarawal Majari people, and working with the school children and others, and actually worked on the edge where the deposits, the rubble horizons had been dated by Jim and colleagues to between about 32 and 50,000 years ago. And after some very careful searching on the last day at the lowest unit, Mike Smith found an unequivocal core that had a whole series of flakes and reductions from it right at the base of the deposit. So we know this site, the edge of a large lake, probably has a whole cultural stratum over the wider Great Sandy Desert with artefacts in it. It'll require some significant exposure to get down to that level, as you can see. But again, another site that we believe has potential to go back before 50,000 years. And here's a picture of that core and the very complex stratigraphic associations across dated dunes and exposures and shell beds around that large lake system. So what's been particularly interesting to me was people like Patrick Decker and others have quite recently suggested that from the South Australian and Northwest core data, at the end of marine isotope stage 4, and so here we're talking 71,000, but up towards 59,000 years ago, experienced cooler and wetter conditions in northern Australia. And so the movement of the monsoonal system 65,000 years ago, and potentially higher charging of lakes and waterways, provides a mechanism potentially for people to enter otherwise more arid landscapes. As they conclude in their paper in 2019, a Marine Corps record and synthesis of Australian climate archives suggests humans would have been met with suitable conditions for settlement in northern Australia during that earlier phase. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the early dates of 6065 are coming from Mudjabavia and elsewhere in the NT. But we think also, given the rapidity with which, or the rapidness with which people expanded and settled right throughout Australia, that the dates for the deserts will be eventually pushed back. Now, of course, water sources are highly varied. I'm going to show you a few pictures of the sort of variety you get in the Great Sandy Desert and areas I'm most familiar with, having worked there since, gosh, in the Great Sandy Desert since 1979, 78, with Charlie Ansell on a survey. One of the ones on the Canning Stock Road, called in the English Godfrey's Tank, but Gunningara in language, is at well 48. It's a very large cistern tank, as you can see. There's young people walking across the edge. It has engravings and paintings. It has explorers' blazes on it. It's a major mythological site. It's known, it's sung about by people over wide areas. But not just large or grandiose sites are part of people's totemic geography. Smaller things like this rock hole with Murgi people recorded during the native title surveys in the early 90s by myself, and larger soaks such as this one to the bottom, and then a big spring mound site out on the Percival Lakes, Yimiri, provided people with a range and a network of water resources and plants in the vicinity of these areas, which allowed them to both fall back on country during drought, to expand rapidly when conditions were good, but importantly, with things like the springs and the portables, the permanent water sources such as Gunningara, Godfrey's Lane, to potentially host large numbers of people. So during ceremonies, during aggregations, during times when people swapped information and a whole range of other things, they could have potentially supported 100 to 200 people. And so we find huge amounts of grinding material, lots of evidence of intensive occupation. People obviously had to produce seeds and bring in fauna and plants and things to keep those groups going during those larger ceremonial cycles. But they were part of the desert cycle without a question. And we see those sorts of water sources actually shown on things like maps. This one here on the left-hand side with numbers shows a record recorded by Norman Tyndale of different water sources over country, which people sing, and there's many meanings at many different levels. Here's a contemporary Murgi paper painting showing different kinds of water sources, vegetation, structures. Again, water is central. A shield with water and totemic travels over that object. It's an everyday shield. And then, of course, a range of things which can be as small as a tiny soak in the dune fields, which can often provide hundreds, if not thousands of litres of water when dug out. And then indeed perched freshwater springs, such as in the Carnarvon Ranges, which provide permanent water. These were all known, sung, and part of people's totemic geography. So the universal elements of desert adaptations is knowledge of patterns of water distribution, and this would have been very early in the stage of people settling the northern deserts, and then of course spreading right throughout the southern deserts. A very broad spectrum of resource use, so a very high component of plants. People used 400, 500, 600 species of plants in many of these areas, and often half to 2/3 of them had medicinal uses. They were used for food, or they were used for apparel, for making things like sandals or carrying dishes or spear throws and so forth. So incredibly important plant-based economies. People had high residential mobility. It didn't mean they moved all the time. It's just that they had mobility as a way of dealing with water scarcity and also water abundance. And they also had portable technology. They had things like the chula adze, which was hafted with a thermoplastic resin onto sticks and spear throws. like a long life chisel, a bit that could last for thousands of blows. And as it wore down and was retouched, it could be reset in the resin and rotated, actually kept by individuals for weeks, if not longer, while moving between country, repairing dishes, making spears, making a whole range of other objects, and being replaced, the bit being replaced when they were close to a quarry or supply zone, a bit of a outback Bunnings network. And the other thing which is quite typical of desertation, and probably was even from the earliest settlements, were permeable territorial boundaries, where living space contracts through time rather than territory. So people could expand, pulse and ebb, move into adjacent country using the kinship skin system to avoid regional droughts and to expand rapidly and exploit areas when in fact there were major rainfall or storm events, which happened both in the wet season in the northern deserts, during winter rains in the south, and then less predictably in the intermediate areas. So some of the implications of our revised desert model is that initial settlement probably happened by 60,000 years ago or not long afterwards, because there were no climatic or environmental barriers. Even though a lot of us thought about the more distant, sandy, less watered deserts as being barriers or challenges, we think now that that probably needs to be turned on its head, that people's intimate knowledge of the water structure, their ability through hypermobility and portable long use life tools and implements, and indeed some of those more pluvial or wetter conditions at 60,000 or before, probably allowed people to penetrate and map onto deserts very quickly. So the revised climate data that we have now from Patrick De Decker and colleagues, we think removes any theoretical constraints for people moving into the deserts. So the concepts of refuges, refugia and corridors, I think is still valuable at both a macro level and at a smaller level at bioregions and even smaller scale zonations of the desert zone that people like Boone Law and others have argued recently using satellite imaging. But we basically think that founding groups use the lakes and networks of water points to expand into the interior rapidly. Now I want to move on to the Desert People project to show how we're going to actually locate some of these sites with good preservation, extend the chronological record, but also look in great detail at changes through time, including the most recent period, the last 1,000 years. So the Desert People project is a laureate fellowship project I've been fortunate to get. It's an Australian Research Council project and allows me and a team of postdoctoral fellows, Wendy Rainin, Kane Ditchfield, Shay Byrne, and a dating fellow at the University of Wollongong, to work with at least 10 Aboriginal corporations, joint management boards, in genuine collaborative research on their country. So the area we'll be working between covers the Cape Range and the areas of the Pilbara coast, through the uplands of the Pilbara, Biff areas, and out into the Little Sandy and Great Sandy Desert regions of the major dune fields. As you can see from these images on this figure, we are focusing on rock shelters and caves because they do tend to have excellent preservation of assemblages, including sometimes early shell implements like dentalium shell beads, twine, hair string, plant materials back to 10,000 years and even earlier, and of course stone artefacts which preserve incredibly well. But we're also going to spend at least a third of our time working on big open sites. We're going to look at where people lived in the open, where they actually had large groups camping, carrying out different kinds of ceremonial open activities in areas like Millstream and across the deserts and the Pilbara flanks. These have been only marginally looked at in the last 20, 30 years, and we think there's an important record there that needs to be studied and it needs to be managed better, because obviously many of the areas in which pastoral tourism and mining impacts occur is in the open, not just in rock shelters. So the project said in very simple terms, it's aiming to bring innovative science and Indigenous knowledge together to develop new understandings of what could be a 60,000 custodianship of Australian deserts. It'll focus on the Ningaloo coast, the Pilbara and the Western Desert, and work with traditional owners and custodians using novel techniques to document places of the highest value for their management and protection, and of course celebration by those communities as well. And here I have a list of the 10 groups that we're currently engaged in research contracts or memorandums of understanding for working across their country, and this includes Ningaloo Joint Management Board, BTAC, Yinjabandi, Rogue River, Winteroti Guruma, Yinawonka, MNR, Biribaloo, Jayak, Nangamada and Karijari. So a large area from the Great Sandy Desert through the Pilbara to the coast. It's obviously a huge area to work on, a large number of corporations, a large number of Aboriginal rangers and custodians, and we'll be doing different kinds of work in the first year, looking at known sites, doing surveys, using remote sensing to look at paleo features, to find lagoons and rivers, creeks and sources which may not have been observed on the ground easily. And we're interested in looking at those connections between the coast and the Pilbara and the interior. And we know that things like shellfish were traded inland. There are baler shells and pearl shells cycled right throughout the Pilbara as far east of the Western Desert and to the south of Yalata and the AYP lands. These were both engraved and plain shells, but also included things like dentalium beads, shellfish, and the conus shellfish I mentioned before from Mandu Mandu. So these are not just on the coast. Shellfish gain an additional importance as they're pumped through the desert systems, and we're interested in looking at those economic and social connections. Here's a chain of connection map redrawn from Kim Ackman's work showing the distribution and movement of Kimberley pearl shell. As you can see, it has an extraordinary distribution across the Pilbara, from the Pilbara coast and Kimberley coast, through the Western Desert, and indeed through Centralia and even out to the edge of the Eastern Deserts. Also baler shell, and this has really been understudied because it does turn up in occupation sites. It will survive on the open sites better than pearl shell. Mike Smith and I collected some from big sites out on the Canning Stock route with Murray custodians in the early 2000s, and just shellfish lying on the surface at big clay pan sites east of the Canning Stock route dated back to 2,500 years ago, all the way through to the present. And of course, there will be earlier examples buried and deposited in occupation sites. Again, look at those chains of connection right through Central Australia and mixing with distribution patterns to the east. And we get a sense of the interconnectedness of these sites when we look at some of the totemic geography maps. Here's an open one, which was drawn by Danny Vachon and Kim Ackerman, showing some of the major mythological tracks that go near Godfrey's Tank I mentioned before, crisscrossing the Canning Stock route, linking up a whole range of water sources. But of course, these are the creation beings, the mythic beings, the Seven Sisters, the Two Dogs, the Echidna, the Samphire Man, a whole range of figures that don't just make country, they are still part of country, they're sentient beings. And here I have a group of Maidu ladies telling me about the Seven Sisters saga, which is an open narrative, and you may well have seen the fantastic exhibition at the WA Museum or the National Museum. In my project, I've got a large team of people who are providing specialist in-kind support, and here I've listed most of them, not all of them, and they include people who specialise in rock art, people who run dating laboratories, such as Zenobia Jacobs and Fiona Pecci, people who work on plant remains, charcoal deposits in old hearths, which can be speciated right back to 50,000 years ago, Emily Dott and Shay Byrne, fauna specialists such as Tina Mann and Carly Monks, and then other people like Jane Baum, Sue O'Connor and others who have worked on desert assemblages and formal records for decades. And so a formidable team that we can bring together particular kinds of projects and questions and issues as the project unfolds over the 5 years. And it represents a huge in-kind contribution to my work, the collective work, but also the work we'll do with communities. providing some 1,000 OSL and radiocarbon dates. We have several work packages and benefits, I guess, planned for the work. One is providing that team of people to provide specialist inputs and advices and productions when needed. But also we have modules for conferences for coastal Pilbara and Western Desert folk. Here I've just profiled the Pilbara one, where during the 5 years, we'll actually be looking at different work packages and doing micro-credentialing for traditional owners, but predominantly rangers, from recording, excavating and processing, analysing animal and plant remains, site preservation, and then collecting charcoal and sediment samples, but also co-presenting and co-publishing on aspects of the work, open domain work, both in national forums, both archaeology, ranger and traditional owner forums, but then some of the big international conferences such as the Southern Deserts Conference, which now will be held in August in Namibia in 2024. I thoroughly urge you all to attend. It'll be a fantastic conference. And then there'll be others in the US and Europe and elsewhere during the next 5 years. So we're hoping to actually produce a new body of information across an area which is under considerable pressure from mining, from new tourism, from pastoral past activities and new ones, and to provide a much better sense of these adjacent rangelands and their cultural values and how they can be better managed. So the third package really looks at co-producing and publishing reports and papers on significant sites, feeding these into policy frameworks at both state and federal level, obviously looking at spatial mapping of cultural landscapes, social surrounds, but particularly open areas which tend to be underrepresented, and to better inform management for mining tourism, NRM. So I mentioned Tim Winton's series coming out very soon was one that we actually worked with, and you'll see traditional owners working at sites talking about both their contemporary significance and extending right back to things like the Mandu beads and how important they are and how they'd like to see them back on country. So please do look at that series, it's quite fabulous. So we're going to be working on some quite different but remarkable country. I mentioned Ningaloo, Cape Range. There are very large shelters and smaller ones, both at sea level, above sea level, and back into the ranges and the different terraces of the limestones, and of course large gorge landscapes as well. There are dome granitic systems across Barabali-Talini country in the coastal Pilbara, which have large numbers of engravings, grinding material and massive open sites. At Yinjirbandi country, Yinjirbandi Nura Aboriginal Corporation, there are big open sites near Millstream Station, near the wetlands, where there's been no large open area excavations, and also some quite significant, very significant sites in the gorges, the Hamersley Ranges. Some of these actually have permanent waters with waterfalls. We'll also be working in the Great Sandy Desert with Karijari and Nangamarda. They have very large estates and IPAs which are adjacent, a large number of shelters with a whole range of values, including occupation records and rock art. And here you can see some of the planning meetings being had up in country here at Bijidanga, meeting with elders, both men and women, and joint teams, designing the survey of these large areas, co-designing what the community and the corporations want and need recorded, and then sharing ideas about how we might go about looking at some of the deeper histories of these areas. Apart from Riwi and Bungabidi, which are both on the edges of the Great Sandy Desert, there has been no systematic dating program anywhere in the Great Sandy Desert, which is quite extraordinary, and this is something we hope to do with the teams. I'll also be working with Western Desert, or now Jayak. We worked very closely around the Darwin Ranges and up through Chilaguru and the Calvert Ranges, Gulpi and further to the north, and Kalamili National Park, where I did my PhD. We're hoping to go into some new areas again, open context and some cave sites, well up in the central country of Jayak's jurisdiction, again, where there's very significant mining pressures, some 40–50% of their 200,000 square kilometre native title determination is under current tenements, and many of the big lakes, which are ethnographically and archaeologically important, are under potash development or post-development. So it's a very busy landscape. Road River will be working in a series of sites which have both incredibly important pastoral records such as Sarah's Cave, but also looking at deep histories nearby as well. And then returning to work with the Yinewonka Aboriginal Corporation at the site of Yira, but also doing surveys around Rockley Station. Very briefly, the Yira site, which was dated to the early 20,000s, 20 years ago, was given a Section 16 to be destroyed, but wasn't, with the community making strong representations to Rio Tinto. We returned to do non-compliance heritage work in last year, and that involved making a larger excavation. The work was directed by Yinewonka Aboriginal Corporation. It was filmed. We did a whole range of plant recovery, very detailed sorting, the lithics, which is still ongoing, flotation, and uncovered the original hearths, which are dated back to about 14 to 18,000. We've got a much deeper deposit beneath this with artefacts to the base. And we've done a series of OSL dating programs. The first set of dates are now recovered, and I'll share those, but they're interim. There's a second paired batch which are being processed as we speak now at Gong. Those dates came back to at least 56,000 years ago. The Bayesian modelling combining the OSL and C14 by Kane Ditchfield, the earliest range of occupation is thought to be between about 65 and 48,000 years ago. Conservatively, I'd say it's in that 50,000 range, but we do have lower facts. And so the dating and the contextual studies will continue. If you look at the model age ranges of other early sites, as I mentioned before, we've definitely got ages clearly in that 50,000 area now in quite a few areas across the arid zone. So Yinewonka traditional owners are working on the lithics. They're doing the sorting. It's been going on now for over a year in the Archaeos lab and also up north, particularly going through the 2mm residues. These are just some of the artefacts and the lithologies recovered between the 1 to 4mm fractions. Fantastic record of plant species and charcoal from the anthropology. Again, we've got a very strong reliance on acacia, but as you can see, a whole range of other species and their Aboriginal names on the left. And of course, this work is based also on ethnobiology, botany being carried out with Roma Butcher, Stuart Ingy Jr. and others by Shayburn on the ground, building up a reference collection at and around the site. So a strong presence of acacia, a bit like the story from Gachara, the resilient acacia story. And here you can see just some of those species. And so the soil analysis continues. Magnetic susceptibility work shows that there's actually significant sediment conversion as there is in the mineralogy, both at the hearth areas we'd expected, but continuing below where the charcoal is lost through oxidation and other taphonomic processes. And so we have the charcoal recovered fireplace, but we have a larger area of magnetic susceptibility distribution. Micromorphology shows good boundaries between different layers as that particular peel extends to the base of the site. And then a range of other ongoing analyses show the site's got pretty good integrity, if not very high. So the site's early. It answers a range of questions that Yinewonka people have been asking over the years, like why were people coming to the site? Were they bringing in ochre? We'd like to know how they're living off the land with the seasonal movements. What was the flow of the creek nearby? How has the flow of the creek changed both pre and post mining? And so we've been able to answer some of these questions now, which of course we wouldn't if the site had been lost and destroyed with the Section 18 back 20 years ago. Now it will be preserved and conserved. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've been able to introduce some of the fascinating for me and currently live discoveries and collaborations and new areas for work, both archaeology, ethnobotanical and anthropological across the deserts of Australia and particularly the northwest deserts. Here are my contact details if you want to send me a message. I'll be gone soon in the desert, but I will respond eventually. And also my publications list and repository at UWA is on this last slide. So thank you very much. And again, a special thank you to my colleagues, the Australian Research Council, and not the least, the generosity and the incredible passion of the 10 Aboriginal Native Title corporations and management boards who are part of this current Desert People project. Thank you.